This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. This week on Up Close, how people treat each other, sometimes disastrously. Kim Goldman's brother was murdered in one of the most notorious crimes of the 20th century. She discusses her experience and her attitudes toward the man found responsible for her brother's killing, O.J. Simpson, in her new book, Can't Forgive. Meantime, within the Jewish tradition, one Orthodox Jewish rabbi and Bar-Ilan University professor believes his community has lost the emphasis it needs to have on the proper way to treat other people, focusing too much on ritual, prayer, and other acts of submission to God. Rabbi Daniel Sperber is the author of On the Relationship of Mitzvot Between Man and His Neighbor and Man and His Maker. And then, to speak about one of the great examples of a man digging deeply into moral degeneracy and the Stoic philosopher who perhaps enabled him, I interviewed James Romm, author of Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero. But first, my interview with Kim Goldman. So, your brother, Ron Goldman, was murdered in one of the more well-known crimes of the 20th century and what was eventually found to have been the responsibility of O.J. Simpson in a civil trial. And you've titled your book, Can't Forgive. Tell us about that struggle for you.
Forgiveness is a real touchy subject, and I know that a lot of people think that if you don't extend forgiveness to somebody, that therefore you lead a less than full life, or that you have darkness in your heart, or that you carry a heavy burden. But for me, I don't feel that. I don't think that double homicide is a forgivable act. So I've managed to figure out another way to live my life that keeps me sane and healthy and strong and empowered, and that's what works for me. How
did your life transform, first of all, when you lost your brother, and then when it became a trial over his killing?
When my brother died, it was obviously the most shocking thing that had ever happened. I never experienced a death, let alone of my brother. It was traumatizing, it was agonizing watching a huge part of my dad die with my brother that day. I assumed a very big role in my family. I then became the protector. I started taking care of my dad, and I wasn't anybody's little sister anymore. You know, it was a weird shift. And then to be catapulted into this public case and chaotic situation and having to grieve publicly was really confusing. But we just stayed steadfast in what we were doing for Ron, and that ultimately, I think, is what helped.
You're also, you're critical of the criminal justice system broadly, but it's interesting how, with you getting tangled up in it, in this context of it being your job, you weren't earning wages and so forth. I think for me, it was my first insight into that aspect of the criminal justice system, where those who are simply trying to see what justice happens regarding their loved ones, that it becomes everything for them, and they don't have any support system necessarily. Well,
you know, I was raised to believe that the court system was where you got justice. You walk through the halls of justice and all of your wrongs get righted. So I went there thinking that honor and integrity and truth would prevail. And I learned quickly that it wasn't really about any of those things. My brother and Nicole quickly got dismissed. It was all about the defendant. It was about the media. It was about, you know, the prosecutors and the defense attorneys and the judge. And my brother and Nicole became secondary. And I just was fighting so much for my brother. And it was bizarre to be in that kind of a fishbowl situation and to see our system play out the way that it did. And then it makes you wonder that if that's happening on live television for the whole world to witness, you wonder what's happening behind closed doors when nobody's watching.
Going back to your title, Can't Forgive. And you don't actually go into any length in the book about what forgiveness means to you. But what does forgiveness mean to you? And where do you get and where do you come upon those ideas?
Forgiveness, I understand the concept of forgiveness meaning that you need to let some things go or process them so that it doesn't debilitate, it doesn't allow, prohibit you from living a full life. I forgive myself for treating myself with less than honor and respect when I beat myself up thinking I wasn't worthy, or that I wasn't lovable, or that if I made decisions because I didn't think I deserved more. I need to let that go because I know I'm a good human and the things that have happened in my life are outside of my control. And that's been a long time for me to get to that place, to know that I'm good. I'm okay. I'm a strong woman. a smart woman and I deserve to have that kind of life for myself. When it comes to forgiveness towards the killer and what he did, it's unforgivable to commit murder not once but twice, to willingly, woefully stab somebody to death. I can't find forgiveness there. I don't think I need to. And I don't think that I'm debilitated in any way by not offering forgiveness. I don't think I have to let myself off the hook for anything. So I'm forgiving myself for not forgiving him.
Discussing Orthodox Judaism's view on the treatment of others, Rabbi Daniel Sperber. Talk about the idea that even within the rabbinic literature, when you put two commandments side by side, that consistently the commandment to do something for one's fellow takes precedence over doing something with an intention of serving God.
Yes, and I think the classic example is the story that appears earlier on Breshit in Parshat Vayera, where...
That's in the beginning of Genesis. Yeah.
Yes, in the beginning of Genesis, when Avraham Avinu is just had his circumcision, and it's on the third day, and it's very painful. He's sitting at the opening of his tent. According to the Bible, God comes to visit him, and he's visiting the sick, which is another of these mitzvot, interpersonal mitzvot. And then these three Bedouin angels, but they look like Bedouin, just turn up, and they're all dusty. They're coming out of the desert. And Abraham says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he says, wait a minute, you can wait, I'll deal with these visitors. And the rabbi said that it's a greater mitzvah to host a stranger than even having a relationship to God. Now, one would think that having a relationship with God should be the sort of the zenith, the ultimate aim of every religious Jew, having some sort of a relationship. In Chassidut, they would call it dveikut, cleaving to God. But here he says to God, wait, I have to deal with these visitors.
Right. Well, that's one of the funny things about Jewish law and ritual, that you find great specification on exactly how ritual should be conducted. But is there even written down anywhere the specifics of like what defines a shove, what defines a push?
One of the things that we're not very careful about, for example, is we're very particular on ritual things in the synagogue and so on and so forth, but we don't mind offending people. Somebody that comes into the synagogue and hasn't got a seat to sit, and he sits on somebody's seat, and the guy says, no, that's my seat, and he pushes it away, and he doesn't realize that actually what he's doing is a very serious avera, it's a very serious crime. You
actually quote one of the great sages of the 20th century on precisely this point, that he was asked what he thought about the growth in pride in the gay community, and he said, and he put it in relative terms that I think a lot of modern Orthodox people might understand.
Yeah, we can't deny the fact that contemporary society presents new challenges, and we have to recognize the fact, and we have to reevaluate many of our so-called traditionally accepted views. And that's always a very difficult and also a dangerous process.
And finally, Seneca at the court of Nero with James Rahm. Now, what's at the core of your book is an idea that dominates much discussion about how people live, which is how do you balance what you want to do and what you should be doing with what you have to do. And you have one of the great tyrants of all time, Nero, who killed pretty much everyone around him, from his mother to his wife to friends and family all around. And at the time, he had with him, for almost all that time he had with him, someone who could have been considered one of the great moral philosophers guiding him.
Okay, so you're speaking of Seneca, obviously, who's the central figure of my book, the moral philosopher who stood by while Nero did these crimes and did not prevent them, and in some cases even had to cover them up, because he was the principal speechwriter and publicity man for the regime, as well as Nero's personal guide and tutor. So he had been appointed Nero's tutor before Nero took power, when he was 12 years old. Did not have a father, did not have any male guidance, but was already considered the heir apparent to take over from his adoptive father Claudius. And his mother, Agrippina, wanted the best instructor, the best moral guide on offer, and that was Seneca.
He is someone who, if you went by his texts alone, if only his texts survived, he might actually be considered one of the great moral philosophers in history. But the problem he has is that we know too much about his life.
Yes, exactly. He did not tell us anything in his own writings about his political career, either because he simply didn't want to, or because it was dangerous to discuss it. So he leaves all that a blank slate. What he does discuss are issues of personal morality, ethics, and the Stoic philosophy that he adhered to, the cultivation of reason over emotion or ambition or the passions.
It struck me at many points reading this how much a comparison could be made between Seneca and one of the great Jewish thinkers, Maimonides. That Maimonides also was someone considered a major moral philosopher, a major philosopher in various realms, and whom we knew almost nothing about in terms of his biography, other than what was in his actual texts, until various discoveries around the Chirogenese, and some of those made him look not so good. And some of the discoveries around Seneca, too, were more modern discoveries that shed a new light.
Yes. Or one could take the case of Martin Heidegger, which is now in the news because Heidegger's black notebooks, his personal musings in the 1930s, have been published for the first time.
Just came out, yeah.
Yes, the first volume has just come out and reveals that he really had some serious anti-Semitic leanings, some pro-Nazi leanings, in spite of being one of the great philosophers of modern times. So how does one reconcile those two things? It's very difficult.
There's one moment in your book where you contemplate, why is he this person with two faces, or why is he someone who acts publicly differently from how he writes? And it's possible, you suggest, that it could be almost a penance.
I think there are many motives in his self-presentation, in his writings, and it's very hard to decode, and I try in various places to tease apart his different levels of motivation. And one of them, I think, as you say, is to punish himself publicly for his shortcomings, for the ways in which he'd failed to live up to his own ideals. And I think the place where you really see that most is in the play Thyestes, his most famous tragedy, which I discuss in my final chapter because it's one of his latest works, where a character who looks very much like Seneca, Thyestes, is subjected to horrible, horrible atrocities, including having to devour his own children as a stew, and is completely destroyed. So if you read that as semi-autobiographical, he was delivering himself a very sharp rebuke.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast, available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish Channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.